Good evening, everybody. I'm David Bagnall, curator with the Lloyd Wright Trust, and I'd like to welcome you to the final lecture in the Trust's program, Lloyd Wright, Origins and Influences. The program has been made possible by the generous support of the Terra Foundation for American Art. Before we begin this evening, I would like to ask everyone to please silence their cell phones. Over the course of 2 summers, the Origins and Influences series has explored the influences upon and connections between progressive architects and designers working at the dawn of the 20th century. From a comparative study of the distinct aesthetic ideologies of Wright and his early contemporary Charles Rennie Mackintosh, through to this evening's lecture, which will explore the origins of the house as a work of art, the series has brought fresh perspectives to bear on Wright's seminal position within the history of modern architecture and design. All of the lectures that are part of the Origins and Influences series have been recorded and can be viewed on the Trust's website, flwright.org. Tonight we're joined by Dr. Wendy Hitchmough. Wendy is Head of Historic Buildings and Research at Historic Royal Palaces, an independent British charity that manages the UK's unoccupied royal palaces. These include the Tower of London, Hampton Court, Kensington Palace, Banqueting House, Kew Palace, and Hillsborough Castle. Prior to her work with Historic Royal Palaces, for 12 years she was curator at the Bloomsbury Artists' Home, Charleston, in East Sussex. An art historian who specializes in the art and architecture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Wendy is the author of 7 books, including CFA Voisey, The Arts and Crafts Home, and Arts and Crafts Gardens. Please join me in welcoming Wendy Hitchmough.
Well, David, thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk in this series about the origins and influences that underpin Lloyd Wright's development as an architect. And I'd particularly like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for supporting this series of lectures. There are 3 things here that particularly interest me. I want to think about what it meant to be an architect for an ambitious young American in 1900, and I'll come back to that. I'm interested in boundaries and innovation. In particular, I'm going to think about the relationship between artists and architects at the turn of the century, and the relative status of successful painters, architects, and craftsmen and women, and the terms of their relationships as a consequence with their clients. And thirdly, as a curator of historic buildings, I'm interested in the ways in which we look at and experience our built heritage, our terms of reference, and the intellectual, aesthetic, and emotional charge that a building can carry, in just the same way that a Rembrandt or a Matisse can move us. At Historic Royal Palaces, we have 4 million visitors a year, and the experience of every one of them will be unique. Indeed, each time you visit a building, your response to it will be particular to that occasion. The experience for Anne Boleyn, for example, arriving here at the Tower of London on the eve of her coronation as Henry VIII's Queen, could hardly have been more romantic. This exquisite 15th century painting shows the White Tower before Henry replaced the conical roofs to the 4 towers with ogee profile roofs in her honour. She would have arrived in a procession of 50 barges rigged and hung with bells and flags, and the following morning she left in a white litter hung with silver bells and carried by 16 of the King's knights. The King's menagerie of lions and elephants guarded the inner ward, and here, as you see, the entry is generous and open to accommodate grandeur and display. 3 years later, Anne's experience of the Tower of London was entirely different. Accused of treason and adultery, she arrived again by river. The heads of her supposed lovers and conspirators, recently decapitated, were arranged on spikes along the route as a forewarning of the fate that awaited her, and she was taken through the portcullis to be incarcerated in the tower. Well, that's an extreme example, and we don't imprison or behead visitors to the Tower of London anymore. But I wanted to introduce it because there is an element of theatre about this great building that Wright might well have appreciated. He was acutely aware of the psychology of arrival and of entry into a building. And because if we're thinking about buildings as works of art, the Tower is an interesting test case. Buildings change over time. They're adapted, not always sympathetically, to meet different uses. The Tower of London was built to withstand siege and tempest, and it has been fortunate in its survival now as a World Heritage Site. Over the centuries, its significance for Londoners and visitors from all over the world has shifted. Here it is towards the end of the 17th century in Johann Spielberg's painting of 1689, very much as part of a fortified settlement with the river in the background. And on the right, as it looks more or less right now, hosting an extraordinary installation by Paul Cummins and Tom Piper to mark the centenary of the First World War. The significance that we invest in the Tower of London as a work of art is nuanced by our perceptions of war and conflict, of torture and imprisonment, of power and magnificence. But its relevance to all of those issues remains constant. If we're looking at Frank Lloyd Wright and the concept that a building might be more than a functional construction, that it might qualify for this alternative significance that transcends functionality, then the Tower of London is an interesting starting point as a building that's withstood the test of time, one of the hallmarks of a great work of art. I want to be transparent too about my own interests in Wright and the way that that is filtered through my current work with palace buildings and, formerly, with the Bloomsbury Artists' Home at Charleston, as well as my research into the arts and crafts movement. All of us, I believe, have these personal filters through which, whether we're aware of them or not, we look at buildings. I visited Blackwell in the Lake District with my father some years ago. He was an ironmonger, and the only things that he remarked upon at the end of the tour were the hinges and window fittings. From my perspective, these were the jewellery of the building, but for my father, a practical man with little interest in the aesthetics of architecture, their interest and significance was altogether different. As an arts and crafts building, Blackwell was self-consciously designed as a work of art. But can the same be said of the Tower of London? Did William the Conqueror even think in such terms when he marched on London with his triumphant army after the Battle of Hastings in 1066? I'm interested in buildings as tokens in a cultural and political exchange, and the Tower, constructed from 1078, was an extraordinary statement of political power and prestige. It was a fortress, a stronghold, as it still is today, but it was also an exquisitely beautiful construction, whitewashed on the outside to accentuate its ethereal, magisterial quality. The Tower was designed before architects were named or even defined as the leading creative force within the nucleus of individuals who make a building. We have no 11th century architects. We don't know how those complementary forces of client, designer, structural engineer, contractor and specialist tradesmen and craftsmen and women that come together in the making of a building, we don't know how that worked under William the Conqueror. The Roby House and Falling Water are incontestably works of art because they're by Frank Lloyd Wright and he was a genius. But that concept that the authorship of a work of art automatically defines its status belongs to the 19th and 20th centuries. Wright was one of a pioneering generation of architects who achieved a celebrity status as artists in their own right. The arts and crafts movement has its roots in England, in the work of William Morris and Philip Webb. As an English art historian, I think I was invited here this evening to tell you that, and I believe it to be true. Morris became a celebrity designer. His edict, "Have nothing in your house which you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful," and the model of his home in Kent, the Red House, precipitated the principles of arts and crafts across Europe and America. But Morris was looking back to a medieval England when artists and designers were anonymous. He was a rule breaker, as any good artist must be. He wanted to smash down the boundaries between architecture, painting, sculpture, and the decorative arts, and their respective hierarchies. His friendships were with artists, and his wife, Jane Morris, was one of the great artist models of the pre-Raphaelite movement. The author, George Bernard Shaw, a regular visitor to their home in Hammersmith, described her as a silent, iconic figure. I quote, "When she came into the room in her strangely beautiful garments, looking at least 8 feet high, the effect was as if she had walked out of an Egyptian tomb at Luxor." This portrait of her by her lover, Dante Gabriele Rossetti, as Proserpine, is in the Tate in London. Well, the young William Morris had just enough money to do as he pleased. He thought perhaps that he might be a poet and then an architect. He apprenticed himself to the Gothic revivalist G.E. Street, but he abandoned architecture to take up painting after only a year. Rossetti became his tutor, and he set up a studio in Red Lion Square with his friend Edward Burne-Jones. It was Morris's idealisation of medieval creative structures, viewed through a Victorian filter, which informed the making of Red House. And we, in turn, have looked at Red House through a 20th century modernist filter to see it as the German architect Hermann Mutasius described it in his influential book Das English Haus, less than 50 years after it was completed. He claimed, and I quote, that it was the first private house of the new artistic culture, the first house to be conceived and built as a unified whole inside and out, the very first example in the history of the modern house. All of that may be true, but Red House became a token, a representative for a style of modernity that would certainly have been alien to William Morris and Philip Webb. Nicholas Pevsner, working in Britain as a refugee from Nazi Germany, cemented its position as a foundation stone in his highly influential Pioneers of the Modern Movement from William Morris to Walter Gropius. And many of you, I am sure, will be familiar with that positioning of arts and crafts as a milestone on the one true path to the international style. Art historical arguments can also be political, and nationalism and national identity were powerful considerations in the creations of an arts and crafts style across Europe and America. There are political filters too to extract and examine in the historiography of arts and crafts. You'll probably be relieved to hear that I'm not planning to do that this evening. But I do want to go back to Morris's idealised vision of Englishness as a medieval style community of artists and makers living and working together in harmony. Of course, it's an invention, an imaginative release from the constraints of Victorian society. It bears little relation to the harsh realities of medieval life, but it does contextualise Morris's work alongside the paintings, the poetry, the novels of the Victorian avant-garde. Painting, sculpture and poetry were essential components of the English arts and crafts movement. Pevsner edited them away because they were unfashionable, sentimental. But for William Morris and Philip Webb, Red House was to be a fusion of art and life. Morris hoped that the L-shaped plan of the house could be extended to form 2 of the sides around an enclosed courtyard, with a home for his lifelong friend, the artist Edward Burne-Jones, and his wife Georgiana, completing the square. His painting on the massive settle, designed by Philip Webb for the hall, was obliterated by brown paint during the war, obscuring inconvenient elements from our vision of arts and crafts. It depicts a scene of Sir Lancelot bringing Sir Tristram and the Belle Isoult to Joyous Gard from the 15th century poet Thomas Malory, whom Morris greatly admired. One of the standing figures is Edward Burne-Jones offering cherries to his wife Georgiana, and Jane Morris is portrayed seated on the left of the composition. By painting directly onto a piece of furniture, Morris challenged the boundaries between architecture, fine and decorative art. Here is an object designed by Webb, painted by Morris and crafted by Peter Dancer. Even as a piece of furniture, part settle, part massive cupboard, it's a rule breaker, and its design and proportions were innovative in the extreme. Morris believed that medieval furniture would have been characterised by this robust simplicity. It's almost the first thing that you see when you come through the front door at the Red House, in conjunction with Webb's assertively modern medieval style furniture. There's no counterfeit here, no reproduction 15th century furniture, but rather a pre-Raphaelite determination to return to the aesthetic purity, the honest simplicity of an age before Raphael and the High Renaissance. What interests me about the settle and other painted decorations at Red House is the way in which Morris and his friends literally positioned themselves within a medieval setting. There are surely parallels between this painted garden with its fruit trees and flowers enclosed by a wattle fence and the actual garden at Red House, which Morris and Webb designed together. Artists often persuaded their friends and associates to serve as models, but there's a significant distinction between fortuitous sittings, such as this Burne-Jones portrayal of Julia Stephen on the right as the Virgin in his Annunciation, and Morris's portraits here. Julia Stephen, by the way, the mother of Virginia Woolf, and when this painting of her was made, she was pregnant with Vanessa Bell. Morris had fallen in love with Jane Burden when she modelled for his painting La Belle Isoult the previous year, and there is an intensity about the handling of this painting as a consequence. History has cast Morris as a designer, but he was more famous during his lifetime as a poet. His poem, The Defence of Guinevere, was also published in March 1858, and Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristram and Isolde were common themes among his pre-Raphaelite contemporaries and beyond. Wagner was composing his great opera, Tristan and Isolde, while Morris was obsessing over this portrait in Red Lion Square in London. We often use works of art to project the future and to cast back over an artist's life, and Morris's sensibility as a designer, his research into medieval clothing, bed hangings, tapestry and table covers are clearly in evidence in this painting. As a model, Jane Burden quickly became the modern personification of Lady Guinevere and other Arthurian women. She had been spotted at the theatre by Rossetti and Burne-Jones in 1857 and persuaded to model for the murals they painted with Morris in the Oxford Union Debating Hall. She was, in pre-Raphaelite terms, a stunner, but she was also the daughter of an Oxford stableman and a laundress. As a wealthy young Oxford graduate, Morris demonstrated his disregard for British class conventions by marrying her within months of completing this painting. And it's no accident that their marriage in April 1859 coincided with the design of Red House by Morris's friend from his architectural training, Philip Webb. Red House realised the medieval setting for Jane Burden's Isolde that Morris had conceived and painted the previous year. Looking at the building as a complex work of art, a youthful collaboration in which poetry, history, painting, architecture and design came together to provide a utopian setting within which artistic lives could be played out, is at least as interesting, I would argue, as the Morris to Gropius view of Red House. It's pertinent to our understanding of Frank Lloyd Wright's early influences because it deconstructs a design-led vision of arts and crafts which has edited away the artists and the wider cultural landscape. Anne Malik gave a brilliant lecture in this series here in Chicago last year, outlining the influence of Morris as a designer on the arts and crafts movement in America, and the friendship between C.R. Ashby and Frank Lloyd Wright. She described one of the significant distinctions between Wright and his English counterparts. For Ashby and for Morris, the simple life was inseparable from social revolution, from a radical political desire to redefine the status of the artisan, the workman, through the making of beautiful objects. For Malik and for Pevsner, this can be distilled down to attitudes to machine production and industrialization. Ashby and his guild of craftsmen were doomed to fail commercially by their Ruskinian insistence on hand craftsmanship, where Wright, as a machine-age man, carried the baton of arts and crafts into the future. But for artisans all over the world, Morris and Ashby trailblazed a challenge to capitalist values. Their move to the country, their commitment to the value of working with their hands, of reviving craft traditions, and of living simply in small, self-sufficient communities, has a political as well as an artistic legacy that the machine age argument fails to recognise. Well, enough of politics. It's painting that I want to talk about here, the arts in arts and crafts. But again, by reinstating a more complete, a more complex picture of English arts and crafts, we might develop a deeper understanding of its influence on the young Frank Lloyd Wright. Edward Burne-Jones, Morris's friend and housemate from Red Lion Square, set out to paint 7 murals at Red House using traditional materials, tempera directly onto wet plaster. In the event, he painted only 3, but this wedding feast on the left from the 15th century tale of Stegrevant refers directly to Morris's ambition in marrying his Isolde, his Guinevere, to inhabit a world of medieval values and beauty untouched by industrialization. And you'll recognise in this painting the portraits of Morris and his bride. 2 of the paintings flank another enormous settle designed by Philip Webb. It was designed, in fact, for Morris's rooms in Red Lion Square, but it was adapted for the Red House living room so that it could double as a modern-day minstrel's gallery. Paint analysis has revealed that it was painted dark red, and Rossetti painted 3 of its panels as a wedding present to the young couple. Morris studied classics at Oxford. He may have been amused or irritated, but he would have understood the allusions in Don Gabriel Rossetti's Dante's Amour. The 3 panels are now in the Tate in London and in the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa, but we can look at them together here as they were intended to be seen in the Red House living room. The face of Beatrice shifts in the 3 paintings from Jane Morris on the left to that of another of Rossetti's models and muses, his future wife Elizabeth Siddal, in the centre and on the right. It's interesting to me that for both Rossetti and Burne-Jones, female beauty was defined by archetypal rather than individual characteristics, diametrically opposed, in fact, to character. Jane Morris, the stableman's daughter turned lady, is said to have inspired the character of Eliza Doolittle in George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, which we all know as My Fair Lady. She's only recently been considered by feminist historians as an individual and artist in her own right. But it is the prerogative of artists to create alternative realities. Rossetti was fascinated by the 14th century poet Dante Alighieri and his tale of the unrequited love for Beatrice Portinari. Here on the left, the poet encounters his earthly Beatrice on the road to Florence. The central panel depicts her death and union with Christ, looking remarkably like William Morris. And on the right, the heavenly Beatrice has become Elizabeth Siddal, and they meet in the Garden of Eden. Rossetti was fascinated by both his models, and he painted Elizabeth Siddal again as Beatrice shortly after her suicide. But here, the triptych is concerned with the divine love of William Morris for Jane. The central angel is doubling as Cupid, holding a heart-shaped arrow to make clear the direction of that love, while the face of Jane Morris is encircled within a crescent moon, mysterious and unknowable. Perhaps it was not altogether kind of Rossetti to plant an image of unrequited love in the heart of the Morris marital home. But then Rossetti was not altogether kind. Even in the years that I've been working as an architectural historian, our understanding of Red House and of the arts and crafts movement has shifted. When I first visited the house, it was still privately owned and lived in by the architect Edward Hollenby, and indeed it's thanks to him that the house survived in such good order. His first monograph sets the house within an architectural context, and it's only in the last few years, under the ownership of the National Trust, that the full extent of its decorated interiors has come to light. Last year, the Trust announced the discovery of an entire wall painting in William and Jane Morris's bedroom, designed to resemble a hanging tapestry and thought to have been painted by Elizabeth Siddal. So on the slide above on the left, you see Burne-Jones's murals as Edward Hollenby had them, as painted interludes within a modern interior. And then below and in progress on the upper right, you see that process of actually revealing how Victorian, how medieval those original murals were designed to be. And the final mural painting, which was only uncovered within the last 12 months, is medieval in style and subject. It depicts Adam and Eve, Noah with his ark, Rachel and Jacob with his foot on the ladder. It's important, as Jan Marsh has noted, because the figures and the quotations below them are drawn from the medieval golden legend. And that's one of Morris's early inspirations, and in fact the first text that the Kelmscott Press was to print. So you see this meshing together of literature, painting, architecture and design. And as a painting, it challenges conventions. As an example of model-turned-artist Elizabeth Siddal exercising her creativity as a painter, working in the bedroom of her fellow model Jane Morris, who in turn became one of arts and crafts' most celebrated embroiderers. Red House may well have been the melting pot within which William and Jane Morris, Burne-Jones, Rossetti, Elizabeth Siddal, Philip Webb and Ford Madox Brown and others explored the boundaries of arts and crafts. It's been classified as the testing ground for creative collaborations and experiments that were formalised through the foundation of Morris & Co. in 1861. I don't deny that its influence in America and in the awareness of Frank Lloyd Wright as a young architect at the beginning of the 20th century was through Morris's commercial initiative. But that is only part of a richer, more culturally engaged picture. To isolate Burne-Jones's murals as a colourful episode in an architectural interior, or to paint out Morris's utopian image on the hall settle, is to rob Red House and arts and crafts of its wider significance. Both Morris and Webb inspired a younger generation of architects and designers. They redefined the relationship between painting and architecture and between tradition and innovation. When the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings was formed in 1877 to conserve Britain's built heritage, its members included painters and writers as well as architects, and its weekly meetings were held above the Morris & Co. showroom on Oxford Street in London. The Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, which gave the movement its name, and the Art Workers Guild in London, providing a meeting place for artists and designers to discuss their work, perpetuated the Red House ideal of painters and designers working together, reviving traditional techniques and materials to reconceive the house as a work of art. Morris & Co.'s commercial success across Britain and America turned arts and crafts into a fashion. By the 1880s, their catalogues advertised painted glass, embroidery, tapestries, and printed cloths for wall hangings and curtains, as well as Morris & Co. wallpapers. The medieval setting that we saw in Morris's Belle Isolte could be purchased mail order. The firm's products were designed as components to be assembled into room settings so that they could be tailored to serve the most modest means. Morris & Co. designed interiors for St James's Palace, but you could also buy their Sussex chairs, their William de Morgan lustreware, and their patterns by the yard from a catalogue for your Californian bungalow. Developments in printing technology and the expansion of a middle-class market eager for guidance on the house beautiful might have undermined the authenticity of the style had it not been for the fact that the principle of arts and crafts were taken up by emerging artists and designers and championed in new international art magazines such as The Studio and Decorative Kunst. Modernity and innovation around the turn of the century were centred on the home. I promised you at the beginning of this talk that I would be transparent about the personal filters through which I look at Frank Lloyd Wright's early work. The architect and designer C.F.A. Voysey barely credited William Morris and Philip Webb as formative influences on his own work, and yet his evolution as a designer of the house as a complete work of art is inconceivable without their example. Similarly, Wright would have absorbed the strong horizontals, the sparse simplicity, and the honest expression of materials from illustrations of Voysey's buildings, meticulously photographed for publication. Like Morris, Voysey's popular appeal was inseparable from his success as a wallpaper designer. He learnt to put a pattern into repeat as a young, independent architect in the 1880s, struggling to make the books balance, and he never looked back. A member of the Art Workers Guild and a regular contributor to the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, he adopted the principle that no detail of the artistic house was too insignificant to benefit from the hand of the designer. And like Morris, his designs were rooted in a highly personal Victorian iconography. He believed that good design, as you see in this drawing for an inlaid workbox, required the heart as well as the combined forces of head and hand. And Voysey's medieval men and women here are perhaps a little more committed to the simple life than Morris's. This oak armchair on the right was bought to form part of the collection of Brighton Museum and Art Gallery from a Voysey house in the Lake District, Moor Crag. Like Wright, Voysey was a gifted self-publicist. He exhibited the plans and elevations for his houses at the Royal Academy, and he had them professionally photographed. This imaging of the house as a work of art was relatively new, and it's pertinent to the very beautiful design drawings of Frank Lloyd Wright. It was characteristic of Voysey to control every aspect of the presentation of his work. He kept a photograph album that he could show to prospective clients, but he also provided magazines such as The Studio and Decorative Kunst with photographs. These drawings of Moor Crag were exhibited at the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society in 1903 and referred to in the Builder's Journal and Architectural Record, the Architect, the Studio Yearbook, and in the Boston edition of Architectural Review. You can just see Lake Windermere in the background to the perspective drawing, and the roofline slopes away almost to the ground on one side to follow the steeply banking contours of the site. Like Philip Webb, Voysey rooted his buildings in their landscapes. The green slate of the roof is locally sourced, and its deep sheltering mass has an organic quality, but is also stylishly offset by the stark white angles of the gables in an assertively artistic composition. Voysey's own house, the Orchard, was even more celebrated. It was lavishly illustrated in Charles Holmes' book, British Domestic Architecture and Decoration, as well as Architectural Review and Country Life between 1899 and 1901, signalling both a popular and a professional following for Voysey's work. In 1907, it was published in America in The Ideal Home. The house was conceived as a complete work of art. It was decorated with plain, bold colours and furnished with simple oak furniture made to Voysey's designs. Slate floors and white painted joinery made reference to traditional English cottages, but the living hall, both the entrance and the heart of the house, was austerely aesthetic. You will see parallels between Voysey's manipulation of light angling down through this screen of vertical balusters to the staircase on the south side of the hall at the orchard and Frank Lloyd Wright's designs. Every detail of the house, from the wrought iron hinges on the doors to the clock on the mantel shelf, was designed by Voysey, and there is a significant shift here from the creative collaborations of Morris and his artist friends. Voysey absorbed Morris's philosophy that every detail of the home might be designed to be beautiful, but he did all of the designing himself. He worked with a small selection of craftsmen who made furniture and metalwork to his designs. He produced patterns for the fashionable wallpaper and textile manufacturers of the day, but creative collaboration was not his forte. Potential clients would be asked to wait here in the hall before being shown into his study on the north side of the house, overlooking the front door. And although Voysey argued that wallpapers were unnecessary if the proportions of your rooms were good, his study and the bedrooms at the orchard were patterned with his designs. So here he is in his study at the orchard, and on the right, the bedroom upstairs, still conforming to the artist's vision in every detail. It's fascinating to me, this imaging of the architect and his lifestyle, this celebrity status, because it marks a turning point in the position of architects from professional men with their places clearly defined by society to artists. There are obvious parallels between Voysey as a designer of the house as a work of art and Frank Lloyd Wright, but there are significant differences too. Here on the left is the homestead, designed by Voysey in 1905 and published in British Architect, Country Life and Modern Bauformen. On the right is the Roby House by Frank Lloyd Wright. I think the comparisons speak for themselves. The emphasis on simplicity and open spaces, with the house conceived as a single coherent entity. The low ceilings and strong horizontal accents. The consistency of the architect's vision through to the furniture and carpets. And the pleasure in structural components as abstract patterns and forms. Both houses were photographed and presented for publication not as lived-in places, but as works of art. As a Victorian and an artist, Voysey understood the symbolism, the unspoken narratives underpinning paintings by his friends and fellow members of the Art Workers Guild. He gave a lecture, Ideas in Things, which was published in 1909, setting out the philosophy behind his work. He likened the spirit of domestic happiness to the form of a tree. Each branch, each bough, he wrote, and I quote, grows a little to one side so that all can enjoy the sun and shower. Can we not get this feeling in our rooms by arranging our furniture and ornaments so that each has its due share, nothing being crowded, and every article helping to make its neighbour's virtue more pronounced? The horizontal for Voysey induced a sense of repose. He wrote, "At sunset we see the horizontal lines as if all nature were reclining and preparing for rest." And the hearth was the very heart of the house. He wrote, "Behold my wide open mantelpiece, broad and simple, as if to make room for many." Both Frank Lloyd Wright and Pevsner would have approved of Voysey's approach to machine production in this lecture. He wrote, "When you design my tables and chairs, you will think of the machine that is going to help in the making, and choose such shapes as are easily worked by machinery. When labour was cheap, and men uneducated and less fit for more intellectual work, the legs and arms of tables and chairs were charmingly curved and formed by hand into fanciful shapes. But now, alas, your wood comes to you machine sawn and machine planed, and the only thought and feeling you can put into your furniture must be through a mechanical medium. So right proportions and the natural qualities of the wood, the suitable colour and texture of the upholstery make up your limited vocabulary. But this passage, so quotable for modernists, was immediately followed by remarks on the appropriateness of high-backed chairs with arms for the master and mistress of the house only, because they were associated with kingship and ceremony, with self-control. Their family and friends were to have low backs with no arms, which also, from Voysey's practical point of view, made it easier for the waiters. I began this talk by wondering what it meant to be an ambitious young architect in America at the beginning of the 20th century. Wright was surely influenced by designs by Morris and Webb, by Voysey and by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, but I believe there was another, more subtle impetus at play here. Turning the pages of the Studio and other magazines, Wright was savvy enough to have recognised a shift in social status. Artists in the second half of the 19th century became increasingly celebrated as individuals. They benefited from a new clientele of successful entrepreneurs who wanted to buy contemporary works of art and were prepared to pay for them. So artists, in short, began to be rich as well as famous and to commission houses of their own. The Homestead and the Roby House, with their claims for the simple life, for an artistic sensibility, were more or less contemporary with the Swedish artists Carl and Karin Larsson's publication of their home in Sundborn. Here on the left is Carl Larsson in his bedroom. Can you see him? And on the right, his portrait of his wife Karin, painted onto one of the downstairs doors. His watercolours of the Larsson family and their home Lilla Hittnes in Sundborn became synonymous with Swedish national identity after the publication of his best-selling book, The House in the Sun, in 1909. Carl Larsson was a celebrity. Throughout Europe, architects and designers were keen to associate with artists because they enjoyed a financial and creative freedom that the professional Victorian architect could only dream about. Colonies of artists and designers proliferated around the turn of the century, reviving the model of the Red House and testing the boundaries between painting, poetry, music, architecture, and national identity. Here in the image above is the living room at Vitrashk, where the three architects and their families, Eliel and Lloyd Saarinen, Amos Lindgren, and Herman and Matilda Geselius, created an architectural utopia. The Finnish artist Akseli Gallen-Kallela designed the rug on the floor, and Sibelius often played the piano here. And below is the entrance to the exhibition hall at the artist colony called the Mathildenhöhe at Darmstadt, where the architects Peter Behrens and Josef Maria Olbrich explored the ideal of Gesamtkunstwerk, designing prototype modern houses for artists and a central building for workshops and exhibitions, which you see here. Often these colonies abandoned the social conventions of monogamy and explored new experimental belief systems and lifestyles. Working at Charleston for 12 years, I encountered a vision of modernity focused around the home of artists Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant that incorporated politics, economics, literature, biography, and the decorative arts as well as painting. This is a portrait of Vanessa Bell by her lover, Duncan Grant, painted at Charleston in 1916. Their friend and Grant's lover, John Maynard Keynes, wrote the economic consequences of the piece at Charleston, and a room in the house was set aside for his use. Vanessa Bell's sister, Virginia Woolf, was a regular visitor. The Bloomsbury circle of friends gathered in one another's homes. Their books, their paintings, their ideas, and the gossip about their love affairs were discussed after dinner in the extraordinarily modern interiors that Bell and Grant designed. It was within this supportive, essentially domestic context that they produced their greatest work. Virginia Woolf and Frank Lloyd Wright rose to stardom around the same time. As celebrities, as artists, they were liberated to produce their best work. And as two of the geniuses of the 20th century, their work has been recast and reviewed through 1,000 different filters. Wright could never have designed Falling Water or the Guggenheim Museum without the complete assurance that he was an artist, that there was a higher purpose to his work, beyond the practical considerations of budget and functionality. That belief, I believe, was rooted in a broader vision of arts and crafts that recognised the potential of a building to encapsulate the culture of its nation, to stand the test of time as a Rembrandt or a Matisse might do. Thank you.